Hi, Lee. How are you? How are
Hey,
you?
hey. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
Hey, how's it going?
it's going great. Glad you could make it.
I don't know if Susan told
Hold up. You're muted, Lee. Lee, you're muted.
you. Yeah, it says the host muted me.
Okay.
All
Okay.
right.
We are live. Lee, you can put something in the Angela if you're able.
You want me to put something to the chat and to answer?
Yeah, if you need to say something, put it into the chat since we are live.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I kind of love the red, white, and blue, Lee. Got the patriotic thing from Veterans Day still happening. I love it. Okay. I don't know where he went. I think we're all muted, perhaps except for me. Okay. Well, good afternoon. We are thrilled to be presenting a timely panel entitled The State of Race, Police Brutality, and Gun Violence in America. This program is sponsored by the ABA Standing Committee on Gun Violence and the Section on Civil Rights and Social Justice. This panel is one of many in a series of rapid response webinars. We are actively planning additional programming on a variety of issues, so please visit americanbar.org/CRSJ for updates on our programs. During today's program, we encourage you to ask questions. We have a very esteemed group of panelists here who are very excited to be with you today, but we're going to ask that you use the Q&A function and not the chat function. If you do not see the controls, please ensure that your screen is not idle. We will address the questions at the end of the panel. We will be sharing a recording of the program to everyone who is registered so that you can share it with your networks after we conclude today. And with that, I'm so very pleased to bring you today's program, The State of Race, Police Brutality, and Gun Violence in America. And at this time, I'm really pleased to introduce our panelist. Our first panelist is Dr. Jennifer Carlson. She's the associate professor for the School of Sociology, the School of Government and Public Policy at the University of Arizona. And she's the author of the recent book, Policing the Second Amendment. Also joining us is Dwayne Crawford. Dwayne is the executive director of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement. Next is Joseph Popkin. He's the director of policy and practice at the Rockefeller Institute of Government. Next is Professor Michael Sierra Arivalo. He's the assistant professor with the Department of Sociology at the University of Texas at Austin. Next, we have Chaplain Kevin Tarver, who is the father of Darius Tarver. Also, we have attorney Lee Merritt, who's the founder of the Merritt Law Firm. And finally, my name's Angela Downs. I'll be serving as your moderator here today. I'm Assistant Director of Experiential Education and a professor of practice of law at the University of North Texas, Dallas College of Law. So very, very excited to be with you. So I want to kick off our discussion, panelists, and I'm going to ask you if we can to unmute our panelists because we really want this to be a conversation. And as I said in the description, this is really our opportunity to talk about everything that's happening. And as we were working on this program all together, things started to shift. We had the election, and so many things have happened after the election that I really want to start our discussion there. Um, And I want to talk about the impact of the recent election. We know that there were 74 million voters who voted for President elect Joseph Biden. The president garnered 70 million votes. The days leading up to the campaign saw caravans. The day of the elections saw discrepancies with voting machines and allegations of voter frauds. And even now, we're left with an election where the president has not conceded. So we want to start there with this question. And Lee, I'm going to actually start with you if you can. Uh, where do we go from here? What do we do?
Well, I think as divided as the country appeared, and pardon me, as divided as the country appeared in terms of the vote split, with 70 million people still voting to keep the current president in place and 74 million voting for a change, we have to move sort of based on what the mandate was. The tipping scale, the voters that put us over the edge were Black women, Black men, and really the issues of criminal justice reform and the value, what has become known blanketly as Black Lives Matter. What that means is that we want to see greater accountability in the criminal justice system. And we're on this line with Mr. Kevin Tarver, whose son, Darius Tarver, I think really encapsulates this shift that universally that there seems to be an agreement on the kind of changes in policing that we want to see. Specifically, Darius Tarver in February of this year was killed by Denton PD. The Denton PD officers responded to Darius in crisis. Darius was suffering a mental health crisis and needed help. His roommates called for help, and law enforcement responded with the militarized tactics that have become common or benchmark for American policing. What I believe was voted on, the shift that we need to see changed. What we want to see is the American policing responding with something other than brutality, responding to mental health crisis with mental health workers, responding to, for example, drug problems in the inner city with drug courts, with addiction programs, and things other than the rampant violence that have become, again, benchmark for American policing.
Thank you, Flay. And I think you bring up a good point talking about the shift that we need to see. And Dwayne, I'm going to get you to chime in as executive director of Noble. Lee talked about looking at community policing, looking at different aspects. Can you comment and can you speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to first get my condolences to the Tarver family, and definitely agree with what Mr. Merritt was saying. At the end of the day, we in law enforcement have really got to be responding to the call for action. I tell people all the time, there's roughly 18,000 agencies out there, law enforcement agencies out there. But whether it was Michael Brown's death or Mr. Floyd's death, and of course Mr. Tarver's death, we have not been able as a nation to come up with comprehensive policing reform, which goes even beyond community policing. We've got to change the law. Good news is it's beginning to happen at the state level. When I say change the law, laws as it relates to use of force, laws as it refers to accreditation, data collection. But the biggest thing is accountability and transparency. And not that I think that a law will solve all of this, but right now, as you know, at the federal level, we're not being able to come up with any kind of comprehensive reform. And I do think the law at least puts national standards in place and also holds our profession accountable. But I would also say to all of our citizens, I think the voices that have been heard, because, someone asked me, well, Dwayne, do you think this will be any different, meaning the protesters this summer compared to previous years? My hope is it will be, but let's be very frank about it. No, nothing has changed holistically within the law enforcement profession that deals with major issues. And I would just say that we've got to be very diligent, and we've got to double down on our demands of our federal government. But I will say this, the optimism I have at the state level, you are beginning to see things be addressed, both in the areas of use of force, training, accountability, transparency, And I will also say the education of our citizens. I'm so excited to see more and more citizens more informed and holding our profession accountable.
That's good. All right. Thank you, Dwayne, for that. And, and I like what you're saying, that it's happening on the state level, but we perhaps need to look on the federal level. And the reason that I'm thinking that that might be something that could really change the narrative is because we do have, bad apple cops who go from agency to agency. So maybe thinking about some nationwide um, networking or nationwide clearinghouse or repository of information might be something that.
Angela, to your point, sorry to interrupt you. To your point, we have the policies written on paper. The Justice and Policing Act that was passed by the House of Representatives has these things in there. Let me also say this. I think the vast majority of the men and women that serve in law enforcement and public safety do a great job. But to your point, at the end of the day, because of the ability to take a person's life, we've got, to your point, if there are officers that we have misconduct recorded, having a national registry of these officers is important. And the good news is this: we have federal policy written out. It hasn't been acted on, but the Justice and Policing Act does allow for that.
Yeah, thank you. Jennifer, I want to talk to you just as we're, I want to bring you into the conversation just because you have really shined a light on the Second Amendment and policing and how that interacts with race. Just to get your comments on what Dwayne is talking about with education and training and things of that nature. Love to get your comments on the discussion.
Yeah, there's so much to say here and so much to unpack. I just want to say thank you for having me on this panel because it's an incredible panel, and also my condolences to the Tarver family. I thinking about hearing what Dwayne has said, I think in terms of accountability and transparency, I just want to throw this out that it's what we mean by those terms can be really different depending on whether we're thinking about them as sort of policy and protocol versus sort of real human connection to this kind of mess we're in with regard to policing. And so much, when I think about those numbers that you just described with regard to the votes for President-elect Biden, the votes for now President Trump, we have a deeply divided country. And it's not just deeply divided in terms of two possible political candidates, but also deeply divided in terms of our understanding of, basic ideas about our history, our reality of what the political situation is that we face. We have not had, and I want to totally tip my hat to Kimberly Crenshaw and the series of webinars that she's been running. If you tuned into that last night, there was a really strong emphasis on the fact that we have not in this country actually had a moment of acknowledgement before we can even get to accountability or transparency. We have not faced ourselves. And when I say we, I'm speaking as a white woman very much and thinking about the way votes have split and how sort of our understandings of policing, when we look at the Pew data, the public opinion data about policing, I absolutely think law is part of the solution. I absolutely think that transparency, accountability, all of these things are crucial. I have a lot to say about the police, but I also want to step back and just say that, we've kind of, historically, this organization of policing and the way that it intersects with race to reproduce white supremacy, to reproduce racial oppression and racial domination, that, those things are, that's a long-standing sort of historical dynamic that has grown up over the last, since the founding of the U.S. and even beyond. But I think that one thing we have to sort of recognize, and again, I'm speaking as a white woman and as a non-law enforcement, is that how the public interfaces with the police. Egon Bittner, a police ethnographer, has written about how the public oftentimes just wants to push their problems on the the police and forget about it. And there's a perversity in that, right? That we want police to solve the problems we don't want to solve. And then when the police screw it up, we want to blame them without saying, what is it that we live in a society that we call on police to basically do society's dirty work? And so I really feel like there's a lot of soul searching and reckoning that needs to be done. And it can't just be about, it has to be about law enforcement, but it has to be about all of us.
Definitely. And Jennifer, you bring up so many points. I don't even know quite where to dive in to kind of go next. I want to bring Michael into the conversation. And I want to pick up on one thing that Jennifer shared with saying that we really haven't faced ourselves as a country to have these conversations. What does that look like? How do we start having those conversations? How do we start having that dialogue?
I think it's a great question. I think it's a big question, Angela. And before diving in, also to Mr. Tarver and your family, my condolences. Thank you for having me here to be part of this. I think the question of how to have the conversation has to begin from a place of radical transparency, of at least being open to, frankly, learning for the first time a history that is intentionally hidden from so many people. In our schools, in our textbooks, we get very selective visions of what this country is. And we get very selective visions of what policing is. Anybody that has talked to a police officer or done a ride along or been a police officer knows that it's not end of watch movies. It's not cops. Most of it is actually dealing with picking up the broken pieces of a system that has decided that police are going to be the ones that are going to go and deal with mental illness, with substance abuse, with poverty, with very limited tools. You can't actually solve any of those problems with handcuffs, batons, and guns. But we've built a system that systematically sends armed agents of the state to try and deal with those problems, even when they're, again, poorly equipped to actually do that. I'm thinking back to some comments made by Lee about military tactics. And one thing I want to highlight based on this election is that you might have a new president, but there have been 1,000 people shot and killed by police like clockwork across administrations. That is not a Trump phenomenon. Donald Trump didn't decide that the police are going to train a particular way. Donald Trump inherited that system, and that system exists today. It's going to exist after the inauguration. That is a conversation that has to take us to a place, I think the word that was used earlier was soul searching, about what the police are supposed to do. Because currently the police get asked to do a lot of stuff, and it's a system that is in some ways doomed to continue to result disproportionately in the death of Black and brown people in the United States. That has to be a starting point. Admitting those things has to be where we start, and then we can work from there. But I think that's going to take courage on the part of individuals, on the part of politicians, on the part of scholars, on the part of police, on the part of people that have been wronged by police, on the people that have been hurt. That is the only place to begin, is by admitting those things and singing those things loudly.
Definitely. Well, what about, the issue of restorative justice? Restorative justice being that you are looking at those that are interfacing with the criminal justice system from the standpoint of getting them to where they need to be. So a less punitive approach, but a more restorative. Many jurisdictions have adopted community policing. They've adopted helping courts or courts that are focused on addressing that issue. Is that a model that might have some staying power to really assist us to what you are describing as the panel, as to where we need to go?
So I'm going to put on my researcher hat, which is that, the evidence needs to be collected. We need to see how these things work. I think there is promising evidence in a variety of contexts, including drug courts, small claims, right? Trying to reduce the load on courts. And people argue, and that's a normal thing, but we're in a country that has actually criminalized argument and criminalized these small things. I think that it suggests that there's a lot to be gained there versus what is very much tradition, heritage in the US, which is to punish, which is to shame, which is to mark and label. We've been funding community policing to the tune of something like $10 billion since 1995. And the evidence that it reduces things like violence, which is what everyone says the police are best at doing, is scant. There's some evidence that it can do things like improve perceptions of police and attitudes, but does it actually directly lead to increased safety? If we are talking about community policing, this idea of cooperative relationships and having citizens influence what the police are going to be doing, citizens deciding what the police are going to focus on, that evidence is weak at best. I think it's a perfectly reasonable suggestion to look at other things, to try other things and see where those things can take us.
Thank you, Michael. Joe, I want to bring you in since we're talking about research. What is your take on this? What does the research tell us?
Yeah. So thank you so much for having me, Angela and Mr. Tarver. I'm sorry for your loss and your family's loss. I think, we have to be very clear about starting from a set of facts. And right now, the facts are that across the United States, gun violence devastates families and communities to the tune of nearly 40,000 people are killed each year, and double that, 80,000 are injured. And those are record numbers. 2018 was at a near record high. 2017 was the highest on record since the CDC started collecting data in 1968. And now, in fact, more people die from firearms than they do from motor vehicle crashes for the first time in our history. So we've seen over the past 10 years that has accelerated. So annual gun deaths over the past 10 years are up 27%. Homicides are up 21%. Suicides are up 30%. And now, for the first time, with this heightened focus on legal intervention and policing, we're also getting better data on the number of people who are killed in police encounters, which is tragically up 62%. So we need to take a look in the mirror. I think everyone is saying that this is a soul-searching moment, and figure out what do we want to do about the problem of gun violence, and how does that intersect with policing. I think some of the things that Dwayne touched upon were that it is not necessarily gun violence is not necessarily a police problem in and of itself, right? Let's think about the other social determinants of what is leading to that violence. And so this week, there was just a report published from some of the consortium researchers that we work with that talked about non-law enforcement interventions, things like improving the physical environment, strengthening anti-violence norms, supporting youth engagement, addressing substance abuse, mental health, things we know that are really perpetuating stressors in our communities, and leading to more violence, leading to more disputes. And I think it's really important to Michael's point that what happened last week, while historic and while a mandate, isn't going to solve all of our problems in 2 months when a new president takes over. And so much of our criminal justice system is delivered by states and local governments. So we can have leadership from the top, and that's going to set a tone. That's going to drive investments and initiatives and funding. But we need the states and the local governments to also build out their capacities to make change. And they have to be change agents within their community. So we know that there are a lot of things that are going to work. We have to divide up what's the job of law enforcement, and what are the policies, practices, procedures that are evidence-based, that are going to lead to outcomes that are not going to have racial disparities built into them or have biases built into them. Then separately, what are the things we're going to do to improve communities so that people aren't being raised in poverty, so that people can have better opportunity, so that they don't have to feel like they have to carry a gun when they go down the street to the store.
Okay, so it sounds like it's a holistic approach is really what you're talking about, Joe. And I love the work that the consortium is doing to look at all of these variety of different issues. I want to shift for just a moment, and I want to bring Chaplain Tarver into our conversation. And Chaplain, I want to lend my voice to the chorus of the other panelists who have shared condolences about the death of your son. And I know that you really have a unique perspective as a chaplain. And you have done work with the city of McKinney, Texas, the chief of police, the advisory council, really looking at policies, procedures, and protocols. But I wanted to ask you, I know that your son was having a mental health episode when the police were called. Can you talk to us perhaps about the impact of having mental health caseworkers or social workers, maybe partnering with the police as something that might have prevented this terrible tragedy for your son.
Yeah, that's a big issue. And thank you all for having me on here. One of the things is, as you don't know, I come from a criminal justice background. Went to school for criminal justice. That was my son's goal as well. He wanted to help change and see the things that I was doing in trying to help be a difference. Sometimes you have to start locally. I didn't know God was choosing me to go to a bigger platform when all this happened. But the thing is Michael was talking about, Trump didn't bring this in, and that's true. And these things have been happening for years. But one of the things you have to address is policing has always been one of our country's most complex and challenging professions. But at the same time, people call the police when they cannot solve problems themselves. And then we have other systems and institutions and parts of social fabric that fail. And then the police inherit these problems at the same time that we want to ignore. And the police are called to repair these things, but at the same time, a lot of times you don't have the training and you don't have the understanding to deal with these people. And one of the things I do is even with the advisory council, we review, we look at what can you change, what can be done better. And one of the things is that you have to have the need for the police accountability. If there's no accountability, it can't be changed. And one of the things that happens is when you're dealing with the people that deal with social work, you deal with people with mental crisis. Well, you need to have social workers. You need to have people that's dealing with the homeless people. You need to have people that can deal with drug people. You need, because a lot of times the problem is a lot of what we're finding out, a lot of the officers that come in, they don't come in and start out bad, but after they've been there for a while, they pick up bad habits. So it becomes be a part of the system. That's where the systematic comes in, because the system is not broken. It's doing exactly what it was basically trained to do. And a lot of times people that have training come in and do things that they shouldn't do because it's accepted. So if you don't start holding the accountability and trying to do, even when I was at the White House speaking with President Trump and we were talking to the U.S. Attorney Barr, I spoke to some of the other leaders in law enforcement, and they were saying that they had social workers that they had taken out of their own budgets, and it changed the whole logistics of how their department operated. Now, like my son's case, here was a case where he was in a mental crisis and he was needed someone to come talk to him. He needed somebody that could understand. And there's do's and there's don't when you start talking about training, de-escalation, and those protocols. And one of the things is there's things you should do. You should always remain calm. You should, have a willingness to understand. You should speak briefly and softly. Don't come in with your guns roaring, because this agitates people. So when you have these things, you're trained for de-escalation. You're trained for, time, distance, and cover. But when you have this training and it's not implied or it's not used, so it's not always the training that the officers need, because they use it on who they want to use it on. Unfortunately, that ends up to be the truth. So you have to be able to partner with different agencies that can come in with a calm head, because the first thing now, my son never even got a chance. And people that's never seen the video, my son was literally praying, saying, my Heavenly Father, my Heavenly Father. They gave him 1 minute and said he would not comply, and they tased him and shot him. These things are not acceptable. And here we are, and he was a member of Noble, he was a National Organization of Black Law Enforcement, Mr. Dwayne. And not only that, he was on the dean's list, keeping the 3.0 average. He wasn't on drugs. This wasn't a kid that was doing anything wrong. He had an accident the prior week. The hospital failed him, law enforcement failed him, and he's dead, and we're hurting, and we're still fighting because of that. But at the same time, instead of accepting what happened, I'm having to deal, even though I support law enforcement, I'm having to fight the injustice of law enforcement, because even the arrogance of the chief, he attacked attacked my family and talking about he don't care about the family grieving. You're not going to talk about my officers, knowing what they had done. And he called it an admirable situation. So when you have these type of things going on in policing, there is a problem. So there has to be accountability, and some of the things that Mr. Michael touched, law enforcement personnel who cannot be trusted or who have abused any person must be held to a higher accountability and a standard. And the way you do this, when you start talking about the F5s, and right now, most of the time it don't provide detailed information on why a police officer was separated from employment. This needs to be known, because when you start doing this, then they can't just go transfer it to another place. There's officers that don't even make it, even with McKinney. They'll go through a whole training and then they have to be dismissed because their mental or the way that they handle situations or come from other departments is not accepted. But there's never a reason, there's never any reason telling these other departments that this is a problem, why not to hire this particular person. So what do? They go to another department where it's accepted, and then they end up killing somebody. It's so much that I could discuss about this, but it's a lot.
The itinerant, those kind of transient cops, it's an issue. It is definitely an issue. You bring up so many good points. I want to go back to Lee and Dwayne. One of the things that I think turned the tide in Chaplain Tarver's case was that there was body cam. And we've seen that body cam video has really changed the conversation and has really worked to shine a spotlight on bad actors in law enforcement. Would love for you to speak about just the power and importance of body cam video as something that should be required for law enforcement agencies.
I'll defer to Mr. Merritt first, and I'll speak. Mr. Merritt.
I think he might be frozen.
Okay, well, I'll go ahead and speak. Yeah, so let me first say this. We at Noble, and again, Mr. Tarver, my heartfelt condolences. Unfortunately, the names of Tarver and Arbery and Floyd and Brown is sad, because especially in communities of color, we don't even have to even give you the full name. We can rattle through them. I was in a meeting recently with Mr. Eric Garner, his mom, discussing her efforts still in New York City, for example, to get full accountability for the loss of her son. As it relates to body worn camera, we're in full agreement of the need to have it. But let's be very frank about this. Are you seeing a significant reduction in questionable deaths at the hands of law enforcement? You're not. And so much of this is, yes, we want them to have body worn cameras. We want them to have them turned on. We want to have policies in place. But the challenge again, culture of I'm going to say this again, there's 18,000 approximately law enforcement agencies, right? So there is not an overarching body for the military or the Pentagon. There isn't a Pentagon for law enforcement. So yes, we want body worn cameras, but we really want to see how do we address the culture? How do we make sure, even if we can't get national standards, at least at the state level, we're able to get standards? Because I'll say this to you, we thought a couple of years ago that body worn cameras are going to solve so much, right? I never forget, I was talking to mayors and police chiefs, and I'm not here to say they're important, but in my humble opinion, what's most important is the sanctity of life. Do we as a profession view the sanctity of life to the point that when you begin to escalate and go through the progression and levels of use of force, that when the decision is made to use the most lethal level of force, have we made sure that our officers and our training and the culture of our departments reflect what? The sanctity of life. I'm not trying to minimize body worn camera. What I'm saying is that on top of that, there's an issue again of how we train, the expectations, the culture. And lastly, I'll say about it, be very frank about it, even how we use our cameras aren't all consistent when you go from agency to agency. And I'm not trying to say that the law will solve this. What I'm saying is we've got to fundamentally, you're going to start hearing the term reimagining policing more and more. And the reason you're hearing that terminology is just really saying and being honest with ourselves. I think Jennifer said this earlier, being fundamentally honest with ourselves as a society. What do we expect out of our law enforcement community? And then more importantly, what do we expect from ourselves? So I'm not trying to be negative about body worn cameras. I'm just saying, to be very frank about it, you're still seeing, unfortunately, these very questionable, in some cases, breaking of the law, and in some cases, murder of unarmed Black males, and in some cases, unarmed Black women. And so I'm just saying to you, I just think it's taking it beyond just, there isn't a tool or a policy or a law that's going to solve this. I think it's fundamentally saying, how do we reimagine our profession in a way that reflects the expectations of our community and the citizens we protect and serve?
Absolutely. So, Lee, I'm not sure if you heard my question. We're talking about body cams. For it's really changed the conversation. Just wanted to get your take on body cams, effectiveness, importance, kind of in shining a light on these cases.
As a practitioner, I'm always relieved when there is body cam and when we have access to the body cam. And as Mr. Crawford pointed out, that is not always uniform across departments. For example, in Mr. Tarver's case, they had the body camera footage, but they refused to release it to the family. And it was because I have the platform that I have as a national attorney that I could put pressure on that department, who reluctantly released the video. And the scary thing, and I think this is what it gets down to, they released the video because they believed that it exonerated their officers, because they have a culture that says shooting a young man in crisis to death is okay. And I think it goes back to what Ms. Carlson was saying earlier, and what was echoed by many of the panelists here. We really need to begin to address both the culture of policing and what our objectives are from law enforcement. I think before we see a change in this culture, it doesn't matter really how many videos of these atrocities that we see. I'm here outside of the courthouse for the murder of a young man named Ahmaud Arbery. And what Ahmaud's case comes down to is criminalization of Blackness itself. It's that our society, particularly the group of men who hunted him down and shot him to death, they are right now making arguments that they were justified in doing so, as law enforcement often makes, because they viewed him as a criminal. And because they suspected him of a crime and he refused to comply, they had the right to take his life. Now, we rarely see those arguments made outside of the scope of law enforcement, but that is the ready response to most officer-involved shootings. And we do that because we live in, we're not honest about who we are as a country, so we've never repented for it. We live in an authoritarian society. We live in the deadliest police culture in the modern world. There is no nation that we compare ourselves to in any other area that kills or incarcerates as many of its citizens as we do. We say that it is okay to incarcerate people for being poor. We say it's okay to incarcerate people for being sick. It's okay to incarcerate people for being Black. We have allowed that for 400 years in this country, and we've never repented from that. And so we have a culture of policing that keeps trying to put a Band-Aid on a system that is a failed system that will never be successful as long as our objectives remain the same. And so as we move forward with the new Biden administration and move forward as a nation, I think we really need to begin to, as Mr. Crawford has said, reimagine policing. We need to reimagine what our goals are as a society. But I'm trying to find the diction to go with the idea that we need to legalize being Black. We need to legalize being sick in this country. We need to legalize being poor. And so law enforcement shouldn't be being called in most of these situations. Until that happens, until we soberly address that culture, we're going to find ourselves circling the same mountain. With my group, I have a group called the Grassroots Law Project, and we started something called the Truth, Justice, and Reconciliation Commissions. Those commissions are modeled after the end of South African apartheid, the commissions that took place to reevaluate their government. in the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions that they had, first they told the truth about who they were as a society. And then they were given an opportunity to change the culture, and the power was shifted. We as a nation continue to try to move to healing without first telling the truth about policing, about first telling the truth about incarceration. The vast majority of the largest prison population in world history has no business behind bars. Those are sick and poor people.
Yeah.
And that has to stop.
Absolutely. Thank you, Lee. Jennifer, I know you've got something to add to the conversation, because you actually began with, shining a light and saying that we really needed to get back to basics and to really talk about these things. So I'd love to get your comments.
Sorry, I was muted. There's just so much to say. I mean, I'm just very overwhelmed just listening to everybody. Everything from, Chaplain Tarver, I think that thank you for sharing, and thank you for choosing to do what you've done. And I think that it is, just the impossible positions that people are put in, to choose whether to fight or to grieve is no decision that anybody should ever have to decide. And yet that is how, fighting these injustices is often, how it often plays out with regard to our legal system, with regard to the political context in which all of this has increasingly unfolded. And, as Michael says, this is it's an incredibly profound point for us to grapple with, that this is, that this is not simply about Trump. This is not simply about one moment in time where there was an election and now we've, and I think that that's what we keep doing with policing. We keep saying, the Kerner Commission, community policing, body cameras, implicit bias, and it's the eagerness with which these sort of reforms are celebrated, and then 5 to 10 years later, the research comes out and and we are right back where we were, except maybe we're actually a few steps backwards, because we've told ourselves, instead of coming sort of, as we've all said, like coming clean about what is the dynamics that are actually going on, we've told ourselves this sort of story of how we care and how we're changing things and how we're transforming. And again, it's a very cheap transformation that is, put in the form of protocols and policies that aren't actually, forcing us to grapple with ourselves. So one of the ways that I think might be just something to add to the conversation that we're having right now is thinking, and I think this is tricky, because I don't want to say that we should entirely decenter the police, because the police are core. That's facing the police and facing our investment in the police as a society is core to sort of the mountain that we are climbing or must climb. But I also think at some moments we need to also think about decentering the police, and even in the context of community policing, for example. In terms of my sort of engagement with this and the scholarly research that I've read and the conversations I've had with law enforcement and what have you, it's still such a police-centric concept. It's community is first, but it's actually policing. That's the fundamental of what that means. And I think of, for example, organizations like Youth Alive. They're very similar to the Violence Interrupters and other places. They are working at the level. They are community driven. They are people who have experienced trauma and who are working with people who are experiencing trauma. One of the things that they do is actually go to hospitals as people are victimized, it's Oakland. It's based in Oakland. They work directly with victims of gun violence at the earliest moment that they possibly can, dealing with sort of stopping the cycle of trauma, dealing with sort of, the layers of, it's emotional, it's legal, there are the burdens of dealing with police violence is just, our national conversation, I feel like, doesn't even scratch the surface of what is actually at stake there. And so, but it's these community organizations that are often underfunded. They are working on a shoestring, and they're doing they're doing the work of policing. They're doing the work of gun violence prevention. And as someone who straddles, scholarship on research on policing and research on guns, they're so often left out of the they're not at this these types of organizations, and I don't even want to, I mean, they're practitioners, they're experts, and that's really my point, is that we need to open up who we see as an expert in and how we can empower them and how we can put resources, not just defund the, so it's like, again, like we talk about defunding the police, let's talk about funding the people who are already doing this work, already making already stopping the cycle of trauma and violence, and already frankly doing gun violence prevention work that, you know, gun control advocates are talking about, you know, up here at the federal level, but at the community level this is already happening. Let's shift the conversation there. So that's kind of, you know, when we talk about community policing, what if we center communities and not center, and again, I know I don't want to not talk about the police, but I think that's an important piece of kind of moving forward. Maybe that's the next mountain to climb after the mountain in front of us.
Well, we've got several mountains to climb, Jennifer. So I think this is, you know, this is a great thing to think about. And the organization that you mentioned was called Youth Alive. Is that correct? Out of Oakland, California?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay, thank you for sharing information.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry if I can. I may have to hop off, but I want to add just a bit, I guess, an amen corner to Ms. Carlson's statement, specifically dealing with a major issue in our country, which is drugs, right? And right now we have allowed for our drug issue to be dealt with primarily by policing, DEA agents, by narcotics divisions, by a war on drugs, right? An ongoing, never-ending war on drugs, that the answer to the drug problems in our inner city community is militarized policing. Well, there is a drug issue in most of our inner city communities, and it does need immediate help. But the answer is not men with guns. It's treatment programs. It's resources. It's things that keep people off of drugs. They help get people off of drugs once they become addicted. And some people see the moniker of defund the police as some sort of an affront to law enforcement. It's not. It's that all of our resources are poured down one hole that is proven ineffective. So why don't we pour those resources somewhere else that may actually effectively address the problem?
All right. Thank you, Lee. That's a great point. Joe and Michael, just because your research, you know, I'm thinking of you as our research gurus here on the panel. How do we bring research and policymakers together? Jennifer talked about bringing all of these different voices to the table. So that things, perhaps we're not forgetting about law enforcement, but that they become less police centric. So would love to get your take on that.
Yeah, sure. I'll start, and then Michael, feel free to jump in.
Great, thank
you.
So
I think, you know, we oftentimes view research in one bucket and policy in another bucket, and never the two shall meet. And I think a lot of time and effort is spent on trying to translate across. And so our Regional Gun Violence Research Consortium is specifically designed to set that table. So in the Northeast, we are a consortium of 7 states and 1 territory, and we work to drive the research agenda towards practitioners and policymakers. And one of the things that I think was shocking when I first kind of started to get a survey of the landscape is just how little gun violence research there is compared to other causes of death. So when you look at other causes of death, gun violence research only receives 1.6% of the funding you would expect. So if you looked at all the other leading causes of death and all the research money that's put into those, only 1.6% is a drop in the bucket. Right now we spend about $22 million a year when we should be spending about $1.4 billion. Similarly, publications on gun violence research, you would expect there to be, you know, loads of articles and scholars, you know, flocking to this as a topic of conversation, and only 5% of the actual amount of publications are there versus what you'd expect for other leading causes of death. So, and that's roughly 1,700 studies a year out of almost 40,000 that you would expect if this was treated like cancer or heart disease or other types of comorbidities. And so with that, we need to have 2 things. One, we have to have a more robust body of research with which we can draw upon. And that gets back to Jennifer's point on, we have to try things. We have to know if they work. We have to know if they're not working. And we have to know it almost in real time. We can't wait 5 years. We can't wait 10 years to figure out that the policy we put out there had a discriminatory impact or it caused more violence. We really need to invest in not only the research, but also evaluation, implementation of programs, and then bringing that to the policymakers. So here in New York, we at the Rockefeller Institute of Government meet on a monthly basis with the state police, the governor's office, and our Division of Criminal Justice Services. And we set the table and we talk about what are we doing with our programs, our policies, what's on the horizon, and what are we seeing? And so it's these type of conversations where we talk about the state's network of gun violence interrupters, which is called our SNUG program. And recently, we were able to take one federal source of funding and apply it to our SNUG programs and provide every SNUG program in the state with a dedicated social worker. Not only because we recognize that they're going to be a value add to the work they're doing to resolve community disputes, but because we realize that the work of community disruption of violence on the ground is traumatizing. And these people live in that community and they also have trauma that needs to be addressed. So having a social worker there not only serves the clients and the people on the street, but also serves the people who are employed in the programs. And so we oftentimes need to bring that policy, bring that ingenuity, bring that research to the hands of practitioners. And it all comes back to setting the broadest table you can and meeting as often as you can to drive down firearm involved injuries, accidents, and deaths. And police are a equation, are part of the equation, but they're not the entirety of the equation.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Joe. Michael, would love to get your thoughts. And then I want to bring in Jennifer. I know she's done some really, really great research in this area as well. So Michael, would love to get your thoughts.
Sure. So as a researcher like Jennifer and Joseph, research is important. And on that note, if you want to read a great book that talks about the evidence on reducing gun violence, specifically, I recommend Bleeding Out by Thomas Abt. It's a great synthesis. It's accessible to policymakers, accessible to law enforcement professionals, people who are interested in the topic, as well as researchers. Now, with that said, as a researcher, I am also skeptical to some degree of our ability to research our way out of the problem. As Jennifer mentioned, we basically confirm a couple of years after any new technology, any new program comes around that as good as we thought it was going to be, the problems are still there. And this is not just a story about body-worn cameras. It's a story with tasers. That's the story with OC spray. That's the story with problem-oriented versus reactionary policing. It is mostly working around the edges. And so to think about this from a public health perspective, the language around it is less about dealing with the ends, dealing with those edges of that distribution. It's about shifting the mean, about shifting the average. Research that looks to see what the marginal return on a given policy, on a given technology is inevitably going to be working on these ends. And so in some ways, what I would advocate for as someone that has spent far too long reading things that have been written from very long ago, is to listen to what it's been saying. I think people talked earlier about the body camera example, and Lee mentioned culture, and that's kind of what I spend a lot of my time thinking about. Policing and its culture will subsume any technology. Tasers can be misused. Tasers can be used excessively, and they can be used brutally. Just because you got body cameras on doesn't mean you're not going to beat somebody half to death. We've got the footage to prove that it doesn't necessarily stop that. But even outside of that, the system around policing is such that you can have the footage, you can have the tasers, you can have the training. And Graham v. Connor still means that it's legal in many places constitutionally. Mm-hmm. State laws that are built on that constitutional precedent will make it legal at the state level. The policies themselves are based off of the constitutional standard in many cases, or some amalgamation of it. And so research is not going to, that's been that way. New research isn't going to change that. It's not going to change it for policymakers or for police. And so in some ways, I would just, advocate again for the need to sit down and be honest about, we already know to a large degree what's happening. And it's not clear to me what technology you're going to implement. I saw somebody in the Q&A asking about psychological screens. You're not going to fix this by having the best filter for policing. policing is very much a story about men, not monsters. This is a system that drives patterns in behavior. You don't need to depend on bad racist cops to still have people dying, to still have police killing people that didn't need to be shot. And I think that I know that. Everyone on this call knows that. And most of the public, I think, strongly suspects or already knows that. So research, I think, is important. I'm never going to say that we don't need to know and use data to guide our decisions. But to some degree, I also am skeptical of calling for more commissions, calling for more research, funding more studies, because we've been doing a lot of it, and people are still dying.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Policing it's men and it's relationships, and that relationships between each other and the community. Absolutely. So Jennifer, would love to get your comments.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something really quick, and I think it can be summed up with, researchers aren't, a world apart. We're also kind of in the mix, in the cultural milieu of a society saturated with, a war on crime that we're only starting to pull out of, right? In terms of how we think about social problems, how we organize governmental apparatuses to address those social problems. And so one of the things, going back to, the comment about that we have actually surprising little amount of research on gun violence. Oftentimes when that's discussed, the discussions about the CDC moratorium on funding gun violence will be discussed, government funding and how that's been sort of brought into the politics of guns. And I just want to actually point out that it's not just that we have less research on guns than we otherwise would because of those funding mandates. But I actually did a project with one of my amazing graduate students at the University of Arizona named Marina James. And we wanted to ask the question, okay, so it's not the case that there has been zero gun related research funded by the federal government. So what has been funded? And what we found overwhelmingly is that what is left is criminal justice approaches to gun violence, forensic approaches to gun violence. So I think, that's another example of, like, if we can just get the right bullet analysis, then we can somehow address things. And very, very much, even public health research sort of bringing a criminal justice lens in, perhaps because that is, seen as a way to maybe appeal to funders who are very skeptical of public health research, given the CDC stuff. So I just want to point out that it's not just that we have these sort of disparities in funding different kinds of, different kinds of deaths in the US, but that the research approaches that we take to looking at guns are so inflected with sort of our broader our tough on crime politics. And so again, to echo Michael about, you can't have, not only can research not save us, but researchers are not going to save us, because we have the same sort of, cognitive hangups in terms of how we think through a lot of this stuff. So again, going back to, how do we break out of this, this space that has been so deeply ingrained in how we think about these things as problems that we need to solve.
Right. Well, thank you. So I know we have so many questions. We are about out of time, but I do want to take one question, and I want to direct it to Dwayne. And the question is from one of the folks that's joined us, is if you can talk to us about a jurisdiction that's really getting it right, that we can look to as an example of non-law enforcement intervention that has successfully supplemented or replaced law enforcement.
Now you're going to put me on the spot. Give you some perspective. Over half the major cities in this country led by the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executive Members, chiefs and sheriffs, et cetera. So I'm probably going to get terminated when I do this. I'll do it by part of the region of the country. We'll try it that way.
Thank you.
So if I'm looking at the Northeast, I think Commissioner Gross up in Boston and Sheriff Tompkins and the folks up there, I think are doing a great job in that Boston area. And again, I'm doing this really somewhat subjective. I'll admit that. But I think definitely up in Boston and those areas, I think NYPD. I know New York is such a separate animal; it's so large, but I think there's been some improvements there. You go further. I'm going to go down the corridor on the East Coast first. I think definitely in places like Raleigh and Durham and those areas there. I think they're doing some good work. I'm now going to kind of go a little bit over in the Midwest and out in those areas. I know Chicago gets really a bad rap. I know there's a lot of issues and people talk about, but I think the superintendent there and that city are trying to address those issues in Detroit. I know these are complex things, but I think the models they're using, San Francisco, I think the chief up there, Scott, he took that job. He invited the Department of Justice to come in and do an assessment of that police department. And I think you're seeing some reform efforts being done there. I'm going to kind of go from the West kind of back out to the Southeast now. I think a lot of the work that's being done in places like South Florida, Broward County, that's a huge county, and the sheriff, you may remember that was where Parkland and the shooting occurred, and that part of the country. And not that it's perfect, but that was a kind of a huge spotlight put on that Broward County Sheriff's Department and the neighboring agencies there. And I think they've done some great work there. But let me just say this. So much of this, I'm not trying to avoid the question, but let me just say this. When you want to see what an agency is really doing, is how does the community respond when something bad happens? Whether it's a shooting that may be questionable, whether it's issues like protests and handling of protests, I think sometimes you begin to see the relationship between an agency and that community when sometimes bad things happen. And it's how does that community rally behind how to address an inequity or perceived inequity, and how do they move forward? And the reason I say this, and I heard a lot about community policing. Let me just say this about community policing. It isn't an activity, it's a culture. Mm-hmm. All right? If you get a chance, look up a man named Lee Brown, Dr. Lee Brown, retired, used to be the police chief, mayor, places like Houston, Texas. He's the father of community policing. Like sometimes we said it earlier, we try to look for this magic wand or the body worn Karen will solve it, or community policing will solve it. But the cities I rattle off really quickly are cities that I think are addressing these issues. Philadelphia, that's been kind of spotlighted over the last week with Commissioner Outlaw. Let me just say this. So much of this is what do we want as a community out of our law enforcement agency? And we at Noble spend hundreds of events that are free to the public of getting the community and law enforcement in a room together to have some real conversations about what does that community want to see from its public safety organization. And I keep going to this. The citizens hold the key to this. Is what will the citizens accept and not accept? Mr. Tarver, I'm sure that the role you're playing now is in how you galvanize citizens to understand that they own the key to this. So much of this is what are we as citizens going to accept? And making sure our voices are being, I'm not trying to say that law enforcement can't change, it can. But we as citizens, my humble opinion, have got to take the bull by the horn and communicate what we expect and hold them accountable. And Mr. Tarver, and I'm very much aware of your son being one of our members. And again, we at Noble are also in many ways still, and just our condolences. And I know our chapter out there and the people that are involved with Noble out there, and Mr. Edmund Dubuque and people like that. And just know that we are still praying for your family and your community. But I do want to say that don't, as citizens, default on your responsibility of getting the reform you want to see.
Right. Thank you, Dwayne. I appreciate your passion and, for really just telling it like it is. I really appreciate it. We are sadly, our time has come to an end. I feel like we could talk really for many, many hours about this topic. I think we really only scratched the surface. But I am so pleased to have such a distinguished panelist. I think that this was such a wonderful conversation, and I know that it provided so much important information for those that took the time out of their schedules to tune in with us. So I want to thank everyone for joining us at this webinar. We'd also like to express our gratitude to you as our panelists for taking time out of your very, very busy schedules. You're all doing such critical work, and you're all really working to move this needle on this very, very important issue. Also, big thank you to the Standing Committee on Gun Violence and the Section of Civil Rights and Social Justice for their work on this programming. And you can also find information about other free webinars. We're going to continue the conversation probably after we leave you here today. So do want to thank everyone for joining in with us. I wish everyone the best of luck, and I hope that you'll stay safe. Thanks so much. Thank you so much, panelists.
Take care. Stay safe, everyone.
God bless you.
Bye, everyone. Pastor Tarver, I will be in touch with you since you're in the Metroplex.
Okay.
Okay.
That's
Joe, take care of my co-counsel, okay?
Yes, thank you so much. Looking forward to it.